Imagine this. You are Anna, barely 19 years old, kneeling on cold stone in a monastery chamber in Cologne in the year 1486. The heavy wooden door closes behind you, with a sound that echoes through your bones. Father Heinrich stands before you, his black robes blending into the shadows cast by a single oil lamp. Your hands tremble as you clutch the rough wool of your dress. You came here because the village priest said you were possessed. 3 nights ago, you woke screaming from nightmares you cannot remember. Yesterday, you spoke harshly to your husband. This morning, the baker's wife claimed she saw you talking to yourself in the market. These small things, these normal human moments, have brought you here. What you don't know yet is that the examination Father Heinrich is about to perform has nothing to do with demons and everything to do with the darkest impulses of men cloaked in holy authority. The room smells of incense and something else underneath, something organic and unsettling. Father Heinrich circles you slowly, his footsteps deliberate on the stone floor. He begins with prayers in Latin you don't understand, his voice rising and falling in practiced rhythms that make your head spin. Then comes the first command: remove your outer garments. For the examination, he explains, to search for the marks the devil leaves on those he claims. Your fingers fumble with the laces at your throat. The other women in your village whispered about exorcisms, about the priests who could drive out demons, but no one mentioned this. No one warned you about standing in your shift before a man who studies your body with eyes that linger too long on the curve of your shoulder, the line of your neck exposed in the lamplight. Father Heinrich moves closer now. His breath carries the scent of wine from evening prayers. He explains in that calm, authoritative voice that demons hide in the flesh, that he must examine you thoroughly to locate their dwelling places. His fingers are cold when they first touch your arm, pressing into your skin as he claims to feel for unnatural heat that indicates demonic presence. You stand frozen, caught between the terror of damnation and the growing awareness that something is profoundly wrong. When you try to step back, he reminds you that resistance itself is a sign of possession. The demon within you fears discovery, he says. The demon within you fights against God's holy work. Every instinct screaming at you to flee becomes, in his twisted logic, proof that you need exactly what he is doing. This scene played out in monastery examination chambers across medieval Europe for centuries. What began as genuine attempts at spiritual healing evolved into a systematic mechanism for abuse that the Church not only permitted, but actively protected. The rituals designed to cast out demons became cover for priests to exploit the most vulnerable women in their communities. Those accused of possession, those suffering from mental illness, those who simply behaved in ways that threatened male authority. All of them faced examinations that had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with violation disguised as holy work. The theological framework that enabled this horror was meticulously documented. Located deep within monastery complexes, these rooms were far from public areas where screams might be heard. The stone walls were thick. The doors were heavy and locked from the outside. Ecclesiastical records from Bavaria describe examination rooms in Tegernsee Abbey that contain specialized furniture. Tables with restraints for women who struggled, chains anchored to walls for cases requiring prolonged treatment. All of this equipment was blessed by bishops and justified as necessary tools for combating supernatural evil. The reality was far more mundane and infinitely more sinister. These were torture chambers where priests could operate without oversight, where a woman's word meant nothing against clerical authority, where the very act of protesting what was being done to her became evidence of demonic influence, requiring even more aggressive intervention. Father Johann Hartlieb documented his exorcism practices in Bavaria during the 1440s with disturbing precision. His records, preserved in monastery archives, describe examination procedures that began with prayers and ended with physical violations he categorized as medical necessity. Hartlieb believed that demons entered the body through specific points and could only be expelled through counter-pressure applied to those same locations. His examinations involved hours of touching, probing, and what he called therapeutic manipulation of female patients. He kept detailed notes on each case, recording which procedures produced which reactions, refining his techniques based on the responses of dozens of women who passed through his examination chamber. When several women complained to local authorities about his treatments, Hartlieb's bishop investigated and concluded that the women themselves were lying, driven by demons to defame a holy man doing God's difficult work. The procedures Hartlieb and others like him employed followed a predictable escalation. Initial examinations focused on searching for devil's marks, spots on the skin supposedly insensitive to pain that indicated where Satan had touched his victims. Priests would use needles, pins, and specially designed probes to test every inch of a woman's body, explaining that thoroughness was essential because demons were cunning and hid their marks in the most intimate locations. Women were expected to remain still and silent during these examinations, their reactions monitored for signs of demonic resistance. Any flinching, any cry of pain, any attempt to cover themselves became evidence requiring more intensive investigation. The logic was circular and inescapable. Cooperation proved possession because demons made their victims docile to hide their presence. Resistance proved possession because demons fought against exposure. There was no response a woman could give that would end the examination before the priest decided it was complete. Now that you have witnessed the mechanisms of these examination chambers and the impossible logic trap that ensnared victims, you are beginning to see how individual abuse became systematic exploitation. The circular reasoning that made every response proof of possession was not accidental, but deliberately constructed to ensure priests maintained absolute control. If uncovering how institutions weaponize authority to exploit the vulnerable resonates with your need to understand the darkest aspects of human history, subscribing ensures you never miss these investigations into the crimes that powerful organizations tried to bury. What comes next reveals how isolation and psychological manipulation transformed examination chambers into instruments of prolonged terror. You are about to discover the sophisticated methods priests used to break women's resistance completely. After the initial physical examination came what priests called spiritual testing. This phase involved isolation in the examination chamber for extended periods, sometimes days or weeks. Women were kept in cells adjoining the examination rooms, brought out for regular sessions where priests performed rituals they claimed would draw out demonic confession. These sessions often occurred at night when the monastery was quiet and other monks were at prayer. The isolation served multiple purposes. It broke down women's resistance through sleep deprivation and constant fear. It prevented them from seeking help or comparing experiences with other victims. It created a psychological dependency where the examining priest became the only human contact, the only voice, the only authority in a terrifying supernatural drama that existed primarily in his imagination. Historical records from dozens of monasteries describe a consistent pattern. Women entered examination chambers with specific complaints, troubling dreams, unexplained illnesses, depression following childbirth, anxiety about salvation. They emerged weeks or months later profoundly traumatized, many never speaking about what occurred during their treatment. Those who did speak faced immediate accusations of lying or continued demonic influence. The few cases that reached secular courts typically ended with judges deferring to ecclesiastical authority. The church handled its own, and what happened in examination chambers stayed buried beneath layers of theological justification and institutional protection. The sophistication of the system is what makes it truly horrifying. This was not random violence or opportunistic abuse by individual corrupt priests. This was an organized methodology with documented procedures, specialized facilities, and institutional backing. Bishops knew what was happening. They received reports from examining priests. They reviewed the documentation. They authorized the continuation of practices that violated every principle of mercy and protection the Church claimed to uphold. When complaints arose, the response was not investigation and reform, but deeper cover-up and victim blaming. The demonic possession framework provided perfect insulation. Any woman who accused a priest of misconduct during exorcism could be dismissed as still possessed. Her accusations interpreted as the devil's attempt to discredit holy work. The patterns become clearer when examining specific outbreaks of demonic possession that swept through convents. The most documented case occurred in Loudun, France, in 1634, where an entire convent of Ursuline nuns claimed possession by demons. The examining priest, Father Urbain Grandier, initially approached the case as genuine spiritual crisis. The nuns displayed behaviors that terrified authorities: convulsions, unknown languages, violent episodes requiring restraint. Church officials brought in exorcists from across France. What these men created was a situation embodying genuine psychological trauma, religious manipulation, and systematic abuse disguised as demonic combat. Sister Jeanne des Anges, the Mother Superior, became the central figure. Her testimony describes 6 months of daily exorcism sessions conducted by multiple priests in a chapel converted into an examination theater where officials could observe. But what happened before these public performances, in private preparation chambers, tells a darker story. Sister Jeanne described being taken to small rooms where exorcists prepared her through methods called spiritual purification. These preparations involved physical contact that nuns initially resisted until learning that resistance itself proved demonic influence, requiring more aggressive intervention. The Loudun case reveals how possession outbreaks followed predictable patterns. It began with women displaying distress, nightmares, anxiety, rebellion against authority. Rather than addressing these as natural human experiences, church authorities diagnosed possession. Examining priests arrived with manuals and procedures. Women were isolated. Examinations began. Then more women displayed similar symptoms. Modern psychology recognizes this as mass psychogenic illness. Medieval authorities interpreted it as demonic contagion requiring ever more intensive intervention. What made Loudoun unusual was it became political scandal. Father Grandier was accused of causing possessions through witchcraft rather than curing them. His trial exposed uncomfortable details about examination procedures, though not enough to challenge the fundamental system. Grandier was executed in 1634, but the larger structure remained intact. The examining priests continued their work elsewhere. Sister Jeanne des Anges lived decades after, eventually writing a memoir that hinted at, but never fully, disclosed what occurred during private examination sessions. Documentary evidence from other outbreaks shows similar patterns. In German convents during the 1550s, possession waves swept through communities, each bringing exorcists implementing increasingly invasive procedures. In Spanish monasteries during the 1640s, novices displayed symptoms requiring months of treatment from traveling priests, building reputations as specialist exorcists while leaving trails of traumatized women. The geographic spread and temporal consistency suggests not isolated incidents, but systematic phenomenon enabled by theological frameworks granting examining priests absolute authority over female bodies. The psychological mechanisms keeping women trapped were sophisticated. Isolation broke down resistance and created dependency on the examining priest as the only authority understanding their suffering. The theological framework convinced many women they genuinely were possessed, that horrifying things being done were necessary for salvation. The threat of execution as witches, if they refused treatment, created powerful incentive for silence. Many emerged psychologically shattered, but unable to articulate what had been done. Their trauma interpreted as evidence of particularly severe demonic influence successfully expelled. The repetition of examinations served multiple purposes. Each session reinforced control and helplessness. Extended treatment periods, sometimes lasting 6 months or longer, allowed priests to condition victims into accepting progressively more invasive procedures. The documentation required for each examination created a paper trail appearing to validate spiritual necessity. This documentation still exists in monastery archives across Europe. Thousands of pages describing examination procedures in clinical language, barely concealing their true nature. What transforms individual cases into systematic abuse is the institutional response when victims spoke out. Rather than investigating allegations against examining priests, church authorities investigated the women making accusations. Canonical law provided multiple mechanisms to dismiss accusations of clerical misconduct, especially during administration of sacraments or sacred rituals. Exorcism qualified as sacred ritual. Therefore, accusations against exorcists could be interpreted as attacks on sacraments themselves, which was heresy. This legal framework meant accusing an examining priest of misconduct became a crime more serious than the abuse itself, punishable by excommunication or worse. Bishops receiving complaints faced a choice: investigate allegations exposing systematic problems or dismiss accusations as demonic deception. The historical record shows which choice most made. Investigation records from multiple dioceses follow the same pattern. The accusing woman was examined for continuing demonic influence, found unreliable due to possession history, and allegations dismissed without interviewing the accused priest. Women who persisted faced renewed exorcism procedures conducted by the very priests they accused, retaliation disguised as spiritual care that effectively silenced further complaints. Protection mechanisms extended to the highest church levels. Canonical regulations made it nearly impossible to prosecute clergy for misconduct during religious duties. As long as a priest claimed actions were part of authorized exorcism ritual, as long as he had documentation showing ongoing demonic possession requiring treatment, he was functionally immune regardless of what he actually did to women in examination chambers. This immunity had predictable effects. Priests who enjoyed conducting examinations built reputations as specialist exorcists and were referred cases from across wide geographic areas. Some traveled constantly, moving from convent to monastery to parish church, treating possession cases, and moving on before the full impact became apparent. These traveling exorcists left no trail of accountability. By the time victims might gather courage to complain, the examining priest was long gone. The lack of communication between dioceses, the absence of any central registry tracking accusations against priests, meant serial abusers could operate for decades without consequence. The most chilling aspect was how it transformed victims into collaborators. Women who endured months of examination, who were psychologically broken by spiritual terror and physical violation, often became the most vigorous defenders of their examining priests when questions arose. Having invested so much suffering in believing their exorcisms were legitimate spiritual combat, these women could not afford to acknowledge exploitation. Their testimony that the examining priest had saved them from damnation became the most powerful defense against accusations. The psychological manipulation was so complete that victims became protective of abusers, making exposing the systematic nature nearly impossible. The connection between possession accusations and witch trials reveals the ultimate horror. When examining priests could not break a woman's resistance through standard exorcism procedures, when victims persisted in claiming no demons possessed them and demanding release, the next step was often accusation of voluntary demonic pact. A woman who resisted exorcism could be reframed as a witch who welcomed demonic presence rather than a possessed victim needing salvation. This reframing shifted her from the category deserving treatment to the category requiring execution. The Würzburg witch trials between 1626 and 1631 demonstrate this progression. Trial records preserved in German archives document at least 157 executions, many of women who had previously been examined for demonic possession. The testimonies extracted under torture describe initial possession symptoms that brought them to examining priests, examination procedures that went on for months, and then the moment when the examining priest declared them not possessed, but willing participants in demonic conspiracy. This declaration transformed victims of clerical abuse into criminals deserving death, permanently silencing them while absolving their examiners. Trial transcripts from Würzburg and similar witch panics preserve fragments of what women tried to say about their examinations before torture reduced testimonies to scripted confessions. A woman named Maria testified that the priest who examined her for possession told her the devil lived in her womb and could only be expelled through repeated applications of holy oil that he administered himself during nightly sessions. Another woman, Gertrude, described being kept in an examination chamber for 8 weeks where the exorcist visited her each evening after compline prayers. Performing rituals, he said, were too sacred and powerful to be witnessed by others. These fragments, buried in documents primarily focused on extracting confessions of witchcraft, hint at the systematic nature of abuse that preceded execution. The number of women silenced through execution will never be known precisely. The 157 documented deaths at Würzburg represent only one series of trials in one region over 5 years. Similar witch panics swept through France, England, Scotland, Spain, and Italy throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Historians estimate tens of thousands of executions across Europe over several centuries. How many of those executed women had previously endured examination procedures by abusive exorcists? How many were killed precisely because they threatened to expose what had been done to them? The questions cannot be answered definitively, but the pattern is clear. Possession accusations brought women into examination chambers where priests held absolute power. Those who survived with their resistance intact became witches, requiring execution. Those who were broken became defenders of the system that had destroyed them. The modern parallel is impossible to ignore, though we must be careful not to overstate it. Institutions today still use spiritual authority to exploit vulnerable people. Religious communities still create environments where certain individuals hold unquestioned power. The mechanisms of isolation, theological justification, and institutional protection that enabled medieval abuse have not disappeared. They have evolved. Understanding how these systems operated helps us recognize their operation in the present. The specifics change, but fundamental dynamics remain. Authority that cannot be questioned, victims whose testimony is dismissed, institutional structures prioritizing protection of the powerful over justice for the exploited. The legacy of medieval exorcism abuse extends into broader cultural impact on how society treats women claiming spiritual or psychological distress. The association between female testimony about internal experiences and accusations of demonic influence created centuries of medical and legal precedent for dismissing women's accounts of their own bodies and minds. When medieval authorities interpreted women's reports of distress, anxiety, or mistreatment as signs of spiritual affliction rather than responses to real harm, they reinforced patterns that would echo for centuries. From the Victorian era's diagnosis of hysteria to the institutionalization of women who resisted male authority in the 20th century, and even today's tendency to downplay women's physical suffering as psychological, these practices stem from a long-standing belief that women's inner experiences were inherently unreliable and in need of male oversight. Clergy who performed invasive rituals under the belief they were expelling demons often saw their actions as sacred duty. But this conviction didn't lessen the damage. It intensified it, granting moral license to acts that caused deep and lasting harm. The combination of sincere religious conviction and systematic abuse demonstrates how ideology can transform ordinary cruelty into sustained campaigns of exploitation. The priests who documented their examination procedures in careful detail, who refined their techniques based on victims' responses, who traveled from community to community treating possession cases, were not cackling villains who knew they were doing evil. They were men who convinced themselves that violating vulnerable women was spiritual warfare, that breaking resistance was casting out demons, that their actions served God regardless of the suffering they caused. This is perhaps the most important lesson from examining medieval exorcism abuse. Evil does not always announce itself as evil. It often arrives wrapped in righteousness, justified by theology, sanctioned by institutions that claim moral authority. The priests who hurt women in examination chambers did so with the blessing of bishops, the guidance of official manuals, the protection of canonical law. They had every reason to believe their actions were not only permissible, but praiseworthy. The women they traumatized had no institutional support, no official voice, no mechanism for justice. When the powerful can harm the vulnerable while genuinely believing they serve a higher good, when institutions protect perpetrators rather than victims. When silence is enforced through spiritual terror, the result is systematic abuse that can persist for centuries. You came into this investigation thinking medieval exorcism might involve religious excess or superstitious practice. Now you leave understanding it was a systematic method for priests to exploit women under cover of spiritual authority, protected by institutional structures designed to ensure their actions never faced consequences. This transformation of your understanding is exactly why examining history's darkest chapters matters. If this journey of discovery has awakened your commitment to exposing how institutions weaponize power, subscribing means you will continue accessing investigations that mainstream history tries to bury. Your willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the past demonstrates the critical thinking necessary to identify similar patterns in the present. The examination chambers are gone now. The manuals that guided examining priests gather dust in archives. The last execution for witchcraft in Europe occurred centuries ago. But the dynamics that enabled that abuse, the willingness to trust authority over victims, the tendency to interpret resistance as proof of guilt, the institutional instinct to protect reputation over pursuing justice, these dynamics persist in various forms. We like to believe we have evolved beyond medieval superstition. We have not evolved beyond the fundamental problem of power imbalance, vulnerable populations, and institutions more committed to self-protection than accountability. Until we fully reckon with how these systems operated in the past and continue operating in the present, until we center victim testimony over institutional reputation, the essential conditions that enabled medieval exorcism abuse remain in place, waiting for new forms of exploitation to emerge. The women who suffered in examination chambers across medieval Europe deserve to be remembered not as unfortunate victims of a superstitious age, but as individuals who endured systematic abuse enabled by sophisticated institutional mechanisms. Their silence was not consent. Their lack of legal recourse was not evidence that no crimes occurred. Their trauma, dismissed by contemporaries as lingering demonic influence or female weakness, was the predictable result of organized exploitation. By examining their experiences and the systems that enabled their abuse, we honor their suffering and sharpen our ability to recognize similar patterns in our own time. The demons medieval priests claimed to fight never existed. The harm those priests inflicted on vulnerable women was entirely real and entirely human, perpetrated by men who should have known better and protected by institutions that absolutely did know better but chose concealment over justice.